Hey there, Emma from Paint Wild, and this is part 2 of the value of values. And in this video, we are going to be painting a bright and colourful Gouldian finch that you might have guessed by now, monochromatically. So we are taking away all of the colour. We're just going to use one. You can use whatever colour you like, but we are really going to be concentrating on the values. If you're not quite sure what I mean by values, please go back and watch the previous video on my channel. I'll link it up in the corner. This will explain everything you need to know, but in a very brief summary, we are concentrating on the lightnesses and the darknesses, the highlights and the shadows without any color to distract us. So my favorite way when painting to really get a handle on the values, my favorite way to do this is to just take the reference photo that I'm using and turn it into grayscale. And that's going to give you a really solid look at where the shadows actually are, because colors are deceiving. The subject we'll be using, the Gouldian finch, has so many bright colors on there, and it can be really deceptive to know how dark to put a color because something looks really bright and saturated. But when you actually take all of the color out of the painting and look at it in grayscale, you actually don't need to be shading there much at all. Now, if you would like to grab a copy of this reference photo, it is free from unsplash.com. I will put the direct link in the description of this video. You can then print that, you can print it in color, you can print it in grayscale, then you can also trace it. But if you'd like to save time, I've created an outline sketch and I've also included the color and the grayscale version of the reference photo in it. And you can download that from my website as a PDF handout. There will be a link in the description for that as well. You'll just need to enter your email address so I can get that PDF over to you and you can paint along with me. In terms of what you're going to need to paint this, you're going to need some paper. You are going to need a brush or two, something like a medium-sized brush, a 6 or an 8, and then a detail brush as well. The brush sizes I like to use are 3/0, 6, and 8. And you'll just need one color. So I am choosing to use Storm, which is one of my handmade paints. It's essentially my version of Payne's Grey. Payne's Grey is a really great color to use for something like this because it has a lot of depth. For more info on that, please do see last week's video where I talk about how some colors are just not really suitable for this. And if you just want more information on supplies that I recommend and like and use, the very first video on my channel will cover all of that for you. So when I paint anything, any wildlife portrait, I like to have the grayscale version of the photo next to me rather than the color one. Because to me, the values are much more important in achieving realism than the color. And generally speaking, I have an idea of what color it needs to be. You know, if I'm painting a flamingo, then I know it's got to be some kind of pinky color. But I'm more concerned with where I need to create the shadows and the highlights to make it look realistic and have it really pop off the page. Just a couple of other notes before we jump in. If this wasn't a demonstration about values and I was just painting it monochromatically for myself or for my students that know the deal already, it could be a bit more efficient than what you're about to see. Because this is just one color we're using, you could do a base layer over the whole bird to start with and then start deepening up particular areas. This can save you some time and reduce harsh edges because you're not painting so many areas up against each other. But in this demo, I break down areas and paint them separately a lot more, at least in the beginning. That's because I don't want any newbies to get confused over the effects of glazing in watercolor. So glazing is when you add a layer on top of another layer that's already dry. And what that does is it's going to make that area darker. It's going to take away some of the transparency, and it can also alter the color if you're painting with multiple ones. Like, it is a form of color mixing as well. But I really want you to see the layers and the values for what they are without that kind of interference from glazing. Towards the end though, you will see me start to paint over larger spaces to kind of join them all together a little bit more. But it isn't such a bad thing to see all the areas painted separately anyway, because that's exactly what we would be doing if we were painting the color version. We would be painting all the blocks separately because they're all different colors. I don't want you to worry too much about harsh lines and double edges, which is basically where you've painted two blocks up against each other and they've formed a little bit of a crust over the edge. This still happens to me all the time, years later, and I really don't stress too much about little things like that happen in watercolor. You can always do things to reduce the severity of them, and you'll see me do that in this painting. This is a real-time tutorial. It's about 45 minutes, and the only thing that I'm going to fast forward through is drying the layers with a heat gun because no one wants to sit through minutes of that. It's boring. But take that into account. If you have a heat gun, you'll need to spend a few more minutes drying the layers at different points, or if you need to let something air dry, it's going to take you longer than 45 minutes to get through it. Now, if you're brand new to watercolor, this realistic monochromatic painting might be a lot for you. I am going to talk you through all the techniques as we go, but I'd love you to have a go anyway, because I think it's a really important lesson to understand in the beginning, and everything just sinks in a little bit more when you do it yourself. All right, let's get into it. I'm all set up here. I've got my outline sketch onto my watercolor piece of paper. I've got it taped down to the table. I've got my brushes at the ready, and I am going to transfer some of my color, which is my handmade version of Payne's Grey, onto a palette so that I've got a little bit more control over watering that down to different strengths. If you are using color from a tube, you can squeeze that out. It's up to you whether you want to let it dry, or if you just want to use that while it's still a bit moist, it may just be a little bit richer. I'm going to get started with what looks to be the lightest part of this painting, which is on the chest of the bird. So I've got a watery little amount of paint there on my palette, and I'm transferring that directly onto the page. I'm not doing this wet on wet, I'm painting straight down into this block. If you are a little bit nervous, you are more than welcome to just put water down in this area first and then start dropping your color in. I'm going to do that wet on wet technique later in the painting, but for now I'm just going to go straight in with this really light amount of color to get me started. I'm going in nice and carefully against the branch. We also want to make sure we leave space for the feet to pop out of there. And you can see some blooms starting to form a little bit. I am painting in Australian summer, but I'm not too fussed about this. Anything that actually looks like it's been painted with watercolor is something I welcome. I'm looking for some areas where I can lift color off and make it a little bit lighter. One in the top left corner of the chest region and another on this right side. It's looking quite blotchy, but now we can add a little bit more color back in to smooth things out while it's still damp. So I'm going to shade the bottom left side a little bit. Take that up the center of the chest. And you don't even have to overlap colors or paint panels next to each other to form harsh lines. Simply painting in an area where you continually drop water and color will push pigment to the outer border of that shape, and that can just create harsh lines in itself, so don't stress about it. While I'm here, I'm going to paint the tail of the bird, the bottom side of the tail that's peeking through under the branch, because it looks to be a similar value. Now, something that is a little cut off from my reference photo to the left is part of the back wing. It's kind of like disappearing underneath the feet, so we will have to just improvise and paint that in later. I just wanted to take out all the distraction of the leaves around it. Now I'm going in with some really rich color here along the bottom part of this tail and letting that flow upwards into this little patch of lighter color that I'd placed originally. And I love this technique of wet on wet and just letting things blend and bleed. It's a really beautiful way to paint. So very rich color, very little water in the mixture down the bottom, and let that flow up and meet the rest. And then we can just use our brush to manipulate the paint and lift it off where we don't want it to be. Whenever you are working wet on wet, watercolor goes where the water is. So if you leave it to stand and air dry, you might actually find that it's gone somewhere you didn't originally place it. That's another reason why I like using a heat gun, because then I just really lock things into place. And the final area that I'm going to do on this layer is just the beak. So I'm going in with a very similar value that I used on the chest originally and the underside of the tail originally. And I'm just popping that over the beak. Using my brush to take away any extra moisture, because I do want to add some darker color to it, just to the tip there. And if there's excess moisture in that area, it's just going to go all over the place. So I don't want there to be too much moisture in there, because I want to control the flow, but at the same time you don't want it to be too dry either, or it won't flow. The joys of watercolor. I've just lifted off a little bit of extra color down the bottom of the tail there before locking that in. So I'm now going in with some of the darker areas. This is really how I like to do my paintings. I like to do the lightest parts, or a bit of a general wash over the body of the animal where I can, where it's one color. And then I like to paint the darkest parts in And then I just spend the rest of the painting bridging the gap between those values. So I've painted the little wing peeking through on the left, nice and dark. And now I'm popping a little bit of colour in the corner above the branch there, and I'm going to pull that up the side just a little bit. But it kind of is distorted a little bit by the tummy, so I'm not going to keep painting that any higher. We'll paint the top of the wing separately. I'm also now on this dry layer accentuating the dark value down the bottom of this tail by painting on a dry layer. Before we had water there, water and a lighter value for it to seep into and flow nice and softly, but I really want to darken that up now. The technique that I did use on that original layer is one of my favorites for getting a dark blend, because often if you put a whole layer of water down first and then drop color in, it dissipates a little bit because there's so much water, it just kind of like flows away into it. But if you actually connect up some wet on dry, where you've painted the paint directly on the paper, no water underneath, but then connect it with another wet area, it just allows you to get a deeper value, but still a nice soft blend. Taking a little bit of darker color up the side of the tail as well. And now I'm going to get started on the back of the head here. I will say I probably struggled a little bit with this part, I think the most of the painting. To me, I was thinking, oh, this is darker than the tummy, but they're actually quite similar in value. So I've gone in a little bit darker than the tummy color. And I'm now dropping the darker color right along the side of the bird, the top part of the wing, and letting that flow in. So this is what I was just talking about with the tail. You can do a patch of water or lighter color, and then where you want it to be really pigmented and punchy, you go in and paint that directly on the dry paper, but let them connect and they'll flow into each other nicely. I'm lifting off some of that color at the top of the head now because I'm realizing I think it's a little bit too punchy. But I do want to drop a little bit of dark color just along the base here, where it's kind of like ruffled and nestled in there. And there's a couple little squiggly lines of ruffled feathers as well that we can add in. It's going to dissipate because this area is a little bit too damp, but that's okay. And then I'm deepening that along the wing as well. Something that watercolor also does is undergo a drying shift. So the color that I'm painting with now looks a little bit bluer than the areas that have dried. This is common, as is it just drying lighter than what you placed it down. When you are doing wet on wet, the water is just going to evaporate some of the color and some of the values. Dipping into a light value now, and I'm just going to do a little loose layer over all these little toes. I really don't like painting bird feet. I think they're weird, I think they're creepy, so I'm just kind of putting a very pale layer over all of the toes and the claws that I can see, and then we'll go back later and we'll shade a little bit of them, draw a couple little wrinkles on top of them, but I just really don't enjoy painting them. But my aim here is I'm trying to paint as many different little blocks as I can without stopping to dry them off, so I'm choosing areas that are not touching up against each other. I'm going to go over the beak while I'm here and go straight over the top of that with another layer. So this is glazing, I'm adding another layer on top. Spreading that all around, removing the excess moisture, and then once again dabbing in some darker color to shade along the split in the beak, the tip of the beak, the bottom of the beak. We just want there to be a bit of separation there. It can be hard to do on wet layers, so sometimes I like to just do a little bit of dry brushing later to really accentuate that in such a tight space where wet on wet is just not working for me. So I'm doing a little bit of lifting on the top of the beak, so that's where you have a clean kind of damp brush and you just collect a little bit off the top. It's like using it like a vacuum basically. The less moisture on your brush, the more it's going to soak up from an area, whereas if you have more moisture on your brush than on the painting, it will explode outwards. I'm now going to paint in this little block around the eye. Looking at this grayscale version, it just looks like that area is all one color, and so I really painted it that way. But obviously if we're going to do the color version, we would be painting two colors in this area, but they just seem to blend together really nicely. So So I'm going in nice and punchy with the dark value, the dark color, because this to me is basically one of the darkest parts of the painting. We've got like the edge of the tail and the wings, also the eyeball, and this area appear to be the darkest to me. So I'm going in really intensely with this color, wrapping it, tucking it right up against the beak. And then I've rinsed off a little bit of color. I've got a lighter value, an ever so lighter value on my brush. And I'm just going to start to connect that upwards onto the rest of the head. I'm trying to do some little jagged brush strokes into the other panel as well, just to look a little bit like rough feathers. And then I'm going to curve that around the top of the head. Ever so carefully go around the eye. And not only do we want to leave the eyeball, but also the little eyelid space around it as well. Tucking that up against the beak. And just working my way inwards. You can use a smaller brush than this if you like. I don't know why I'm persisting with my size 8, but that's okay. And it's not a perfect circle, it's almost a little bit flat across the top of the eye. And now I'm going to lift off a little bit of color from the top. So again, using my brush like a bit of a vacuum, then grabbing some darker color from the pan and dropping that in the bottom of this panel to make that darker. I'm dry brushing a line between the beak opening now. This area is all dry, but I'm just sketching that ever so lightly across the center, or where it should be. And that's just going to help create that illusion of the beak opening, like that's where the opening is. And I've just lifted a tiny little bit of color off the inner corner of the eye and dried that all off. And you can see just subtly lifting areas and deepening others of the same shape. It just really helps it make it look a lot more three-dimensional. And so we need to paint in this chest area now of the bird. So I'm going in with some reasonably light color at this point. It probably was the original value of the chest, the bottom half of the chest, but I'm deepening it up now because I realize it can be, and it should be, a lot darker than that area. So rinsed a little bit of color off my brush to take it around to the right. And filling in that whole area now before we worry about doing anything else. And I'm just going to lift off a little at the top. So it's not a super obvious light source. It is in nature, so it is lit by the sun, but it's not a very strong light source. But to me, it does look like it's coming from the top down. So that's why I lifted off the top of the head. That's why I'm keeping this chest that sticks out further than the bird a little bit lighter, because that's where the sun or the light source would be catching it. And then we can deepen the edges around. Adding some jagged strokes along the bottom of this area as well into the lighter part of the chest, just again to give the quick and easy illusion of feathers. I don't like the idea of painting every single strand of fur and every single feather into a painting. I don't think it's necessary to make something realistic, and I think if you do that, you're more going down the route of hyperrealism, photorealism, and that's fine. It's just not something I want to do. But I've dropped a little bit of darker color into the left side and also just where it is meeting the lighter part on the chest in the center, and then dried that all off. I'm going to go straight in with another layer because I recognize that I did not do this area dark enough. So I'm carefully going over all those little jagged strokes of feathers that I created on the previous layer, trying to match those up. And this is where you do start to create things like harsh edges, especially when you have flicked little feathers or fur out to the side and you're trying to match that up on another layer. So rinsing off, dabbing off, and lifting in the same area again, just really making this look rounded and sticking out. Dipping into some darker colour, taking that off to the side on my palette and dropping that in the same kind of areas. The very left where it's tucking under the wing, where it's tucking under the head, and also just on the bottom as well. And this again is just accentuating that, making it look rounded, a little bit puffy, sticking out. And just fiddling with that to make it a little bit smoother before locking it in by drying it all off. We're looking pretty good now. I reckon I could have left that chest alone, but I ended up doing another layer on it later. I think I made all of my values a little darker than they were in the reference, but that's okay. As long as you're consistent with making them lighter or darker across all areas, it's still going to look perfectly realistic. But I'm going into the back of the head now for another layer to really deepen up some of those areas. It's up to you whether you want to go in with a light color like I am on my brush. Just quickly going in with a darker color down the edge now, really accentuating that and letting it flow back into the moisture. Or if you just want to do water, it's completely up to you. You might feel a little bit more in control of the values if you start with water and manually drop them in. Just be aware that if you do constantly work with water and adding to it, you do increase the chances of creating harsh lines as you introduce more color and water to that patch and push it out to the edges, as well as it's just going to take longer to build the values up because every time your wet on wet layer dries, it's going to evaporate some of that color. And now I decide I'm going to connect this area up with the darker side on the right, just to try and smooth things out a little bit there. And so I'm going in and dropping some darker color in there now that I've got water in the whole area. Obviously, we would not be doing this if we were painting the color version because these are two different colored areas. But given it's monochromatic, we can do this and make everything look a little bit softer. Dabbing, 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 accentuating the deeper values up against the bottom of the chin region, and then drying that off. Now I've formed some harsh lines here, and what I've done is dip a piece of paper towel into water and squeeze out the excess, and I'm cleaning off a brush. This is not the brush I've been painting with, it's just a spare brush that's very old. And what I do is I scrub directly along the harsh line that I'm trying to reduce the severity of. So you want to be careful, you don't want to be scrubbing out to the side, back and forth, or up and down, or else you're just going to scrub and move color in places you didn't want it to. You really have to go with the line, scrubbing gently on it and dabbing with your paper towel. And with your paper towel, you want to gently rotate each side you press it down every time you do it, or what you're going to do is create a stamp. You're going to press it down the first time, you'll find you have an outline of color on it, and when you press it down the next time, instead of removing paint, you're just making a stamp. So make sure to rotate where you stamp it down each time. I'm now going to add just a couple of little shadows in on the back of the head on a dry layer. So I'm accentuating the little fuzziness of the feathers, the ruffledness of the feathers, and ever so gently just scrubbing those in with a very dry brush. Very little color on this. So as you can see from my paper towel, it is one of my best friends. I use it a lot to control the amount of water and paint that's on my brush. So I'm just looking for a few little spots now that I can just kind of add a little bit here and there, make a few little ruffle feather shadows. I'm trying to avoid at this point doing even more wet on wet layers, but that's not to say that I won't have to. I'm winging a lot of this. I don't always have a plan going into a painting, and I don't always know how it's going to work out even if I do have a plan, so I just go with the flow. So I'm doing a little bit of dry brushing here in the hopes of avoiding more wet on wet layers. I'm dry brushing some darker color on the tip of the beak and along that central line, the split, along the bottom of the beak as well to shade that. I'm just being very light-handed here, very careful, just bit by bit by bit. Because ideally we don't want to do 100 layers of wet on wet in a painting, or it does really take out the transparency of the medium. It dulls everything down a little bit. If that's your motive, then that's fine, but me personally, I'm really trying to work towards having lighter paintings. and it's very easy to get carried away. So I often just try to remind myself, okay, let's just take a step back, see if we can shade something with dry brushing rather than a whole another layer. But we need to paint this branch in now. That is the last little bit that we are missing. Well, the eye and a little bit of the wing, but we're going to paint this branch in first. So I'm using a darker color than I started the chest with. I don't have in my mind like, oh, this is value 1, this is value 2, this is value 3. I'm not thinking about values like that. I'm just using what I've put down to be the benchmark for what I need. So I can see that the branch is darker than the chest on the bird, so I can start with a darker color there and it's going to be fine. Will I still need to shade it later and deepen the value? Probably, but it's a starting point. So I'm going very carefully against the toes, and while I'm there, I'm dropping some darker color in and around them. And then we can take that all the way out to the side. And when that's dry, we can worry more about shading and doing some dry brushing. I love doing some dry brushing strokes on branches and wood. I think it really just creates an amazing texture. Grabbing some darker color and just dropping in some shadows in a couple little places. Like I'm trying to do the bottom of the branch there to shade it because we've established the light source is at the top. I'm trying to shade around the little knobbly bits of the branch, and I'm also going to try and do the opposite here and lift off at the top of the branch. Smooth things out a little and then we can dry it off. Grabbing some darker color now on my palette and really dabbing off the excess on paper towel. This is my non-good brush, this is my old brush, and I'm using it to scumble and rub my brush on the page and really pull out some texture. So the idea here is we've got deep color on the brush, but not a lot of water. And that allows the bristles to kind of skip over the paper. It's not full on hitting every little single crevice because we are using slightly textured paper, or I am anyway, cold press. And it just allows you to skip over the raised parts on the paper and catch them and create this really fun texture. And notice I'm dragging my brush from left to right as well. And that is because I'm trying to follow the pattern and the shape of the branch. If I came in here with diagonal strokes of texture on this branch, it's going to take away the realism of it. So I'm following the direction that it grows. And so I've shaded some of those knobbly bits of the branch. I've added texture all over and added some deeper value just around the base of the bird. And while I'm here, I'm going to shade the left sides of all of these little toes. So I've just established in my mind at this point that the light source is above but slightly more to the right. And the way that I have decided that is because the right side of the chest looks lighter than the left side of the chest. So I am therefore shading the opposite side on the feet. I'm shading the left sides of those little toes. And this is just some beginner shading. We'll have to come back and add a little bit more later. So now that the branch is in, that has allowed me to see that this wing at the back is not dark enough. So I'm adding some darker paint there. And now I realize the underside of the tail is also pretty light and will need reworking, as is the whole chest at this stage. I'm also gently now carving in that wing from the right side that is gone from the black and white version of the reference. And then drying that all off. I'm going back in with some darker color because it's just way too light at this stage. That's just going to help the little toes pop out a little bit more as well. They are very similar in value to the chest of the bird when you look at the grayscale reference photo. Getting some medium value with some water mixed in on my palette and dipping into some more water now as I place this down on the chest of the bird. Looking to deepen that up because it's a bit too light at this stage. Dipping into some more water again, and this is where I decide to start marrying up all the little panels together to avoid any more harsh lines and just allow me to work a little bit more freely. I can just drop some darker value in multiple places, 2 birds, 1 stone kind of thing, pun intended, and we can work a little bit quicker. So I could have done something like this at the beginning, but at some point we would have had to separate these panels because they are very clearly different in value. And we know what the color version looks like, and they are different colors in there, so we would have had to do them separately. But putting a nice wet on wet layer across all of them is going to avoid any more harsh lines around all those edges, and we can just work a little bit faster. So I'm really starting to accentuate the shadow on the left side of the chest. I want there to be this little pale separator down the center of the chest. So I've left that pale at the bottom. I'm deepening up a little bit on the back of the neck. So I definitely think I've gone darker there, but honestly I go darker on the whole thing so it all works out in the end. I'm deepening up the same areas of the chest, under the little neck where it's all tucked in, and then along the bottom of that top chest area as well. And just lifting again in that central area to make that look rounded and sticking out and catching the light. And I do really love working on layers like this because you can really start to get soft gradients. Sometimes when you get started, your first layer looks a little bit patchy, and it's all these subsequent ones that really soften the look. So I'm just trying to work on this lighter chest area. Still want to keep a lighter area down the center of the chest, which is not necessarily the center of our painting because the bird is turned to the right and facing away from us. So just spreading that all around and continuing to just make it nice and soft and create gradients between the colors, nothing too stark. And now obviously I need to match that energy on the bottom of this tail because they look very similar in value in the grayscale version. So going straight over the top of that lighter patch and connecting that all up. And just doing a little bit of lifting where it looks lighter on the right, and same with the chest as well. Again, just honoring that light source that we decided on the right. So lifting down the center of the chest and a little bit at the bottom above the feet, and then this little corner on the top of the lighter chest part as well. Sometimes you have to, as you can see, repeat things a few times because you are working wet on wet and the color is just going to travel back to where you lifted it. It just wants to go where it can. With a bit of a light value now, I'm going to do a couple of kind of feathery looking strokes on this tail. I wanted it to look a little bit, not ruffled, but like layered. I wanted it to look like lots of feathers were all tucked in there, which they are, you know. It's the same if we could see the wings in this photo. If you spread out the wings of a bird, there's a ton of feathers in there, but when the wings lay flat, it's all condensed, but there's a lot of layering going on. So I'm creating some layering there. I'm creating these kind of rounded strokes at the bottom. I'm really just doing this very loosely and not exactly to the reference, but I'm doing little gaps between them. I'm trying to make it look like there's lots of rounded feathers stacked on top of each other. So I'm doing these kind of semi-circle or semi-oval shapes and just kind of layering them under each other, progressively getting smaller as they reach the bottom of the tail and leaving gaps between them all to show that there is layering going on. I've got a bit of a medium value here on my brush and I've dabbed off lots of the excess. And I'm going to go in on these little toes and just start painting little lines. I don't know if you've ever seen a bird's foot up close, but there's like lots of little lines on them. It's similar to like if you looked at our hands and you looked at like a knuckle. There's lots of little lines in there and they've got so many more bends in their toes than we do on our fingers. So I'm doing lots of curved but kind of horizontal strokes across those feet and then going back over the shadows that I created on the left. And like I said, I don't enjoy painting bird feet. I think they're quite creepy. This is kind of the extent of the detail that I'm going to do on them. With my spare brush now, I'm dipping into some colour, pretty medium value, dabbing off the excess, and I am going to start dry brushing a little bit more on this branch in between the toes to really make them pop and separate them from the background. Create also a little bit of a shadow under the bird being cast onto the branch by its chest. And dry brush some more texture across the branch as well. Focusing some of that at the bottom and under the bird just to create the illusion of shadow and the light source. And using my better, more precise brush, I'm just really going right up against those little feet, getting in there in all the little nooks and crannies, and that's just really going to bring those feet forward. Grabbing my spare brush again, and I'm cleaning it off and dabbing it off. I'm going to do a little bit of lifting off some harsh edges again. I've got one happening on the very edge of the bird. Now you want to be really careful when you're doing this on the edge of something up against the white of your paper. You definitely want to rotate your paper towel when you do this, or just make sure you've flicked over to a cleaner area of it, because it is going to lift that color off and place it back down like a stamp if you don't. Now be very careful to follow the edge as it is. Don't be dragging it out left to right, or you're just going to drag that color straight into the beautiful white of your paper. Sometimes I don't think it's worth doing this on the edge of something. It can be riskier than just leaving it. I wanted to give it a bit of a go. If you look at my painting up close, you can see though that that edge looks a little bit fuzzier than like the top of the head, because I have accidentally taken like a little bit of color outside of the line where it should be. It's not too noticeable, but you know, it's one of those things sometimes where you just have to weigh up the risk of whether you bother doing that or not. Now here, however, where these two panels meet each other, it's a lot easier for me to just go in there and scrub that, because I'm not going to be dragging color. You know, it's the same color. It doesn't matter if it's dragged a little bit across. But I wanted to lighten that up before I go in again with a darker layer, just so I'm not continually making deeper and deeper crusts. So going in there now, and this time I'm painting directly over the little eye gap that we'd left for the eyelid and the eye, because as you can see, it's still gonna stick out. The color all around that eye has been much darker than the panel that we left blank, so even painting this light layer over, we're still gonna be able to see it afterwards. So that is a perfect example of, you know, negative painting. We painted around the eye and now we've glazed on the top of it, and you can really see how adding glazed layers can affect the depth of the areas. And this is why I did want to separate them a little bit more, just so you could see that without that confusing effect of glazing. But once you have everything roughly where you need it, combining them all under one layer, provided it's the same color, is going to be totally fine, and it's just going to deepen everything consistently. I'm now doing a little bit of shading. I'm wanting to shade just a little bit along this inner eye, and I probably should have specified when I lifted that color off. It was more like lifting off the cheek, and now what I'm trying to do is create a bit of a shadow on the inner corner of the eye, and also like what would be, imagine if you drew like eyeliner on the bird, like winged eyeliner coming up from the corner. It's a bit of a diagonal that I'm creating, and this is just going to recess that eye into the head a little bit. I'm reducing the severity of that area I lifted, But that was essentially what I was trying to create, like almost like a little cheekbone, but we're pushing the eye back into the head. So I'm just going to accentuate that again now that I've dried it off. Go straight back over that, just dry brushing on a bit of a diagonal. So we're doing like a little bit of a cat eye, winged eyeliner moment, and an inner corner moment as well. And then I just did like a little patch of ruffled feathers on the top of the head that I could see. And just matching that up with the eye now. So really creating an eyeliner look, wrapping that around the eye. And connecting that up with the one on the bottom. And this also just helps create the illusion of like a bit of an eyebrow. You can see that a little bit better now. So now I'm going to paint the rest of the eye in. So far we've just got a really light wash of color when we did a glaze layer over that area. But now I'm going to go in and I'm going to paint the eye. Now we want to be really slow and steady here. When we paint this dark part of the eye in, we still want to leave the eyelid. So you can see I'm leaving a little bit of gap with that little bit of lighter color on the edge. And then as we fill this in, we want to be really careful and smart and create some highlights in there as well. Now I'm going to cheat a little bit at the end and just add some white gouache to make the highlight pop. But if you're careful, you can negatively paint the highlight in. So I've outlined the eye now. It's almost like a bit of a soft triangle shape. And as I fill in the center, I'm going to leave like two tiny little circles of lighter color peeking through to be the highlight in the eye. So creating one there. And separating them a little bit there. But because I did have a layer, that glazed layer of lighter color there over the top, I'm just doing a little bit of scrubbing and lifting, by the way, just to grab some of that color back. Because we did do a little bit of a light wash over it, I felt like I wanted to do a pop of white gouache on there to really make the highlight nice and bright. But that face is looking a lot more realistic now. I'm dipping into some medium value and dabbing off excess moisture on the corner of my paper towel. And now what I'm going to do is look for some areas that I can smooth out by dry brushing, but also texturize a little bit, like add a little bit of feather texture without painstakingly painting every bit of feather in. So I felt like this shadow needed to come up a little bit more on the back of the head. So I'm just like sweeping my brush, creating little feathery strokes, deepening up those little ruffled feather areas. I think that part of the head ended up looking like way smoother in my version than the reference, but that's okay. So if you want to add more ruffly texture to that part of the head, the back of the head, feel free. I'm going in and trying to find a few little more spots that look all ruffled and paint the shadows underneath them. This is just a really fun study to do, and you will miss things. Like when I looked at this photo again in color, I was like, oh geez, I didn't even realize there were so many colors running into each other. I really just painted these panels all as one thing. But it is a great lesson in where you need to concentrate your shadows, and that is why so many artists do a value study before they start painting, so that they don't have to think about it when they're already busy thinking about colors and color placement and color mixing. I'm dry brushing around the edges of this big bulbous chest shape now, just to really accentuate those shadows. So you want to follow the direction of the feather growth as well. You don't want to be doing horizontal strokes here when the feathers are all laying, relatively vertically, a little bit on the diagonal. Deepening up the branch again between all the little toesies, separating them a bit more, making them pop a little bit, bring them to the foreground. And that is why values and shading is important as well. You can use it to push things back and pull things forward. Very gently just doing a little line down the center of the chest here, smoothing out a little bit of harshness on the edge there where colour had just kind of collected on the edge. I'm trying to smooth that out and create a bit of a softer gradient back into the chest, accentuating a little highlight on the top left of this lighter chest. Now I start dragging up some darker colour here, and then I don't like it. I feel like I've gone too far, so I'm going to dab it off. It's just looking too patchy, too yucky, too dark. So I'm going to use my handy dandy paper towel to just collect that up. And it's just going to full on soften that area. It's still a little bit texturized, but it just took the intensity out of it. I'm grabbing my regular palette now, which happens to house my white watercolor. You can use white gouache or a gel pen, whatever you like. And I just want to paint the tiniest of little dots on the eye. We did negatively paint around that highlight, but I really want to make it pop. So I'm trying to get a really concentrated amount on my very tiny brush here. And I'm just gonna plop a tiny little highlight there. And that's definitely a lot punchier. And then we can dry that all off and remove the tape, because that is the end of our Gouldian finch painting. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, this deeper dive into values and how much more important they are than colour. If you were trying to achieve realism, let me interrupt myself as I go back and deepen that little wing that I'd forgotten about. But to me, colour can be quite distracting, particularly when you are painting something so bright, so vibrant, so many colours like a Gouldian finch. It can be really interesting to do a study of this portrait without any of that distracting colour in there. If realism is something that you're interested in, whether it be in watercolour or another medium, then understanding highlights and shadows and mid-tones and values is just a really important thing to wrap your head around. But whatever you do, don't be seeking perfection and then beating yourself up if it's not perfect. I don't think anything I've ever painted is perfect, but I have a fun time doing it, and every time you practice, you get a little bit better. And if this really stoked the fire in your, I was going to say loins, I don't know if that's quite, maybe let's just go with in your heart, and you've decided you really would love to learn how to paint more wildlife, more animals in watercolor, feel free to come on over and check out my membership at paintwild.com, where we have, I think, over 80 animal tutorials at this point, with a new one every 2 weeks. I would love to have you and share the joy of watercolor wildlife with you. If you paint the Gouldian finch, I would love to see it over on Instagram. You can tag me at PaintWildAcademy, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. I'll catch you then.